Good evening and welcome to Politico Live. My name is Joshua Pasana. I'm a senior policy reporter at Politico Europe, but I'm also the convener-in-chief for this year's Politico 28 list, which we're presenting today. That's our rundown of the people we reckon will be driving the debate and making the big decisions across the continent next year. The first 24 names are now live on our website. That's politico.eu, if you didn't know it already. The final 4 names, the most important people on the list, will come to you over the next hour. First, I have to level with you. We had expected to present this list to you today from a busy gala dinner in downtown Brussels, and instead I'm sat in an almost empty conference room round the back of the EU Council building, almost alone. So I'm going to be enjoying some frites on the way home in the rain tonight, instead of that 3-course meal, but you guys still get an hour of, we hope, entertaining discussion about European politics. We've got 2 brilliant interviews coming up for you in the space of the next hour. The World Trade Organization's Director General, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, spoke to my colleague Barbara Moens about 20 minutes ago in this room. We'll play back that tape. Then we'll have the EU's de facto climate minister, Frans Timmermans, live in the room, talking to Playbook's Suzanne Lynch too. I've also patched in some friends of mine from the Politico newsroom to talk about some of the names on the list as we go through the next hour, so you'll hear from some colleagues too. Before all of that, I want to hand over to our partner for this event, Soraya Benchik. She's the managing director for Diageo's Northern European market. Thanks to them for making this event possible for tonight. The floor is yours, Soraya.
Distinguished guests and all those of you that have tuned in online. Diageo is honored to partner Politico to bring you the class of 2022, albeit digitally. I want to start by thanking Politico for hosting this event digitally in very challenging circumstances. After all, only a week ago, I thought I was going to be able to join you in Brussels and celebrate this evening together. I would also like to thank Executive Vice President Timmermans and General Okonjo-Iweala for their time and their insights. At Diageo, our purpose is to celebrate life every day and everywhere. Tonight, we come together to celebrate the dreamers, the disruptors, and the doers that have shaped Europe in this past year, which has been a very special year indeed. And Europe has set very bold goals for a more sustainable and equitable future. These dreams are not only aspirations, but they are responsibilities towards our future generations. Achieving these enormous tasks cannot weigh on governments alone, which is why we at Diageo, a global company with a strong European footprint, take this responsibility very seriously. We dream of an inclusive and sustainable world, and our Society 2030 plan shows our commitment to this future. Some of the highlights of this plan are promoting, for instance, sustainability, where we have made a commitment to become carbon neutral by 2030, or championing inclusion and diversity with a commitment and targets to achieve women in 50% of our senior leadership roles, or making a positive contribution to our local communities, for example, supporting our farming communities. But it is important not just to dream, but to dare to act. And we've been honouring our European tradition of hospitality. And following another challenging year, which has highlighted the importance of the hospitality sector in our society and its ability to lift our spirits, we've been helping bars and restaurants stay open by following safety guidelines, and we launched a $100 million Raise the Bar program to support bars and restaurants as they welcome back customers after the shutdowns. So progress is set in motion day by day in small steps. And Politico's doers lead the way with their actions impacting citizens and businesses, big and small. Everyday effort also drives our vision, be it from sustainability pledges to lifting the spirits of our communities, or our commitment to raising the bar with the hospitality sector. It is every day that we seek to celebrate this season. So let's raise a glass to enjoying life every day and everywhere. I wish you all a wonderful evening. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Soraya. So this wouldn't be a Politico event unless we had a Slido poll. And of course, today we're asking if you can help us help the European Central Bank pick somebody to go on the next generation of Euro banknotes. They're on the lookout in a consultancy period for suggestions about how to update these notes a little bit, how to make them a little bit more modern. So we ask you on Slido, you can log in via the hashtag Politico28, who you reckon or what you reckon should be on the new Euro banknotes. If you put your suggestion in there, that'll be compiled into a word cloud. We'll come back at the end of today's event and show you what the popular choices are. There's already one coming through that is overwhelmingly popular with those of you that's voted already. So let's see if that person stays at the top. So before we zoom off and discuss European politics for 45-50 minutes, let's first zoom to a hotel room in Hong Kong, where our editor-in-chief, Jamil Andalini, is going through a quite tough hotel quarantine period. Hi, Jamil. Thanks for staying up to 2 in the morning to speak to us today. How's the food over there?
Thank you very much, Josh. Yeah, the food is surprisingly good, I have to say. I'm not even 1 week into my quarantine, so I'm not sure how I'll feel about it after 3 weeks of being stuck in this room. But good evening, everyone. I'd really like to welcome you all to the 7th annual Politico Power 28 unveiling ceremony. This is where we reveal our guide to the most powerful people in Europe today. Of course, as Josh said, we would have really preferred to hold this event with you all in person, but that's obviously not possible again this year. When we are able to, we do plan to hold a gala dinner to properly celebrate the unveiling of our choices for 2022. Our journalists, led by Josh, have consulted very widely to bring you this list. And I and the rest of our team, we're just really very proud of this work that goes into compiling the list. I want to be clear, though, that this is not actually an awards event in the traditional sense. The people here are not winners, and we're not endorsing the political positions or actions of those who make it onto the list each year. Instead, it's really meant to be an accurate portrayal of the sources and the currents of European power today. In a reflection of how quickly things are changing in this part of the world, and also the diffused nature of power on the continent, the list this year contains just 4 people from last year's list. This year, for the first time, we've actually included someone, astronaut Samantha Cristoforetti, who will not be on our planet next year. We've also chosen Carrie Johnson rather than her Prime Minister husband. And we've included the founder of the investigative open source powerhouse Bellingcat. I think it's important to mention the big gap that's been left by the departure from the political stage of Angela Merkel. That was our most powerful person on last year's list. But to a greater or lesser extent, all the people on the list this year will have to find ways to deal with the problems that the de facto leader of Europe has swept under the rug for so long, even if she may end up on the banknotes, according to our poll. I hope you all enjoy the excellent interviews that we have lined up for you tonight, and I hope you'll all join me in recognizing the most powerful people in Europe this year. Now I'm going to hand it back to Josh, and good night.
Thank you, Jamil. I think you put everything lightly there and appropriately. You've explained the situation and the annual list that we make. Good night in Hong Kong. So just before we head off and speak to the Director General of the World Trade Organization, maybe to just explain that we'll come back straight after. We'll run through the #1 doer on our list, the #1 dreamer on our list, and the #1 disruptor. They're the 3 subcategories underneath the overall #1, which we'll then unveil right at the end of today's conversation. So, for now, let me hand over to Barbara Moons, our senior trade reporter, who's going to carry out what was a very interesting interview with the World Trade Organization's Director General, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala.
Welcome, Dr. Okonjo-Iweala, and thank you for being with us tonight. You are our #2 disruptor tonight, as you are trying to shake up the global trading system and also using your platform to push for vaccine equity. We were originally supposed to discuss the ministerial conference, which was supposed to happen last week, but got cancelled because of the pandemic. With the ministerial pushed back, the members have not yet agreed on a new date. What does this delay mean for the World Trade Organization, and especially as it's already going through troubled waters?
Well, I think that having to postpone the ministerial was a very tough decision. And unfortunate in the sense that we had been working so hard. Ambassadors had been negotiating, everybody was trying to really get results at the ministerial. And unfortunately, we were caught in this Omicron war, if you want to call it that, and we had to postpone. As I've told many, it took us a couple of days just to recalibrate, but what we are doing now is that we're back at work, pushing the negotiations. So we've been working hard all week. We'll be working hard next week. I think the holidays will come in. And when we come back, we'll continue. I've just sent out a letter today. We've been putting a deadline of end February to get the results on both fisheries and a response to the pandemic. So yes, it's disappointing that we had to postpone, but that doesn't stop the work.
Okay, and this new deadline that you've said, it obviously helps to put pressure on negotiations, but don't you also need the political pressure and the gathering of ministers to make sure that decisions are taken on these negotiations that are have been going rather difficult on several topics?
Yeah, it's true that you get somewhere in the negotiations where really political decisions are needed. But it also, and this is why ministers convene, but that model I've also urged in the letter I sent out, we have to revamp it because we just do not know the trajectory of this pandemic. We don't know what countries are going to do with travel restrictions and quarantine and things like that. So we have to change the way we do business. So what we're really asking ministers is to empower the ambassadors, use this holiday time to really sit with the ambassadors, discuss the issues and give them the political power to come back and negotiate and clean out the brackets that were there. That's what we're asking. And, we have modern means of communications. If a delegation here feels that they really need to talk to their minister, well, we have the means to connect them so that they can have that talk and then get back to the negotiations. In the meantime, we'll be watching to see what happens with the pandemic and the new variant and that situation. If, for instance, it gets better and there's a chance to have a ministerial, we will sound the membership to see if they're willing. So it's not that I've ruled it out, but we certainly do not want to be held hostage to it. So we want to continue the work. And if we finish, we can use virtual means to bring ministers in. We've done a virtual meeting before and it worked. It wasn't really a decision-making one, so we'd have to devise means for them to be able to make a decision, but it's not impossible.
Okay, and before the ministerial got cancelled, just a couple of days before, it was still unclear what, if anything, would have come out of the meeting. Part of that, especially seen from a Brussels point of view, was seen as a lack of engagement from the US administration. Do you have any hopes that this might change in the coming months, especially as Joe Biden's nominee to the WTO could be confirmed in the near future? Will this unblock the situation, for example, with the appellate body, the WTO highest dispute court?
Well, let me take this issue. I disagree somewhat with the view that the US was not engaged. The US has been engaging on various issues. They've engaged on the issue of fisheries. They've been very active. They've engaged in other negotiations. They've been there in agriculture. In the response to the pandemic, they were there, and in the outcome document. You can say perhaps the level of engagement differs from one issue to the other, but they've most definitely been engaged. And we've been able to talk to Catherine Tai. Now, on the issue of dispute settlement, you're absolutely right that the US has had problems with this for quite some time. And they were not ready really to say how they wanted to get the reforms to the system done. So that's correct. But what has happened is getting towards the ministerial. They were willing and able to agree that we should put together a process at the ministerial that would lead us towards a reform of this system. So that, I think that's the only area where they felt they were not ready to really lay out how they wanted to see the dispute settlement system reformed. And of course, you know that this is quote unquote what people call the jewel in the crown of the WTO. And so everyone is quite anxious to see that system reform. But we at least got to the stage where we were working on language that ministers could agree to that would set us on a path towards reform of the dispute settlement system.
Okay, I'd like to move on to the issue of vaccine equity, because I know it's very close to your heart as a former chair of the Vaccine Alliance, Gavi. You mentioned the February deadline earlier. Is this one of the issues that you want negotiated solution on, either a trade and health declaration or even the more sensitive issue of waiving patents for COVID-19 vaccines, which until now WTO members have not been able to agree on?
Yes, I absolutely feel that having a response to the pandemic on the trade side is very, very important, because we've been able to demonstrate that trade can be part of the solution and WTO can be part of the solution to this pandemic. That's why I think a response is important, not only on issues of intellectual property and waiving intellectual property, but also on issues of export restrictions and prohibitions, because this is what impinges on supply chains working really well. Also on issues of really working with manufacturers on the granular bottlenecks that they face. We've been able to do that successfully. And if you go to our website, you'll see studies published of what we've been doing with them that has led to us to help them to be able to increase production. Remember that production has had to be tripled worldwide, where we were producing 5 billion doses of vaccines totally before the pandemic. We now need 15 billion, 12 billion to 15 billion. And we've been able to work with them to up that. So response to the pandemic consists of several parts, consists of this issue of lowering and making sure we don't have export restrictions and prohibitions, and that we work on trade facilitation measures so that inputs from medical countermeasures and outputs can flow freely. You have the area of working with manufacturers to try and ease their bottlenecks and work with them to invest in emerging markets and developing countries so that they can manufacture vaccines and other things. And the third part is transfer of technology and intellectual property waiver. And so that part, I think, that's where we were having difficulties of members coming together. It's been over a year that almost 100 developing country members asked for the waiver. Now, what we're trying to do now is not let the pressure off. I hope that by end of February, we will indeed have an answer to the intellectual property issue so that we can have a package, if you will, on all across this spectrum that I spelled out, which would be a response to the pandemic, not only to this pandemic, but also spelling out what we would do if there's a future pandemic, so we don't have to revisit all these issues.
Yeah, you previously urged countries to drop the all or nothing approach in these negotiations. Was that a message that was also directed to the EU, which does not want to waive intellectual property rights?
It was directed at everybody, because the WTO is a negotiating forum. So we can't have you can't come and say, give me this or else, or give me, I won't do that or else, because then nobody will get anything if we have such a polarized situation. So it's really directed at all the parties who are trying to negotiate this issue, that if we have an all or nothing attitude, we'll all walk away with nothing. And I still maintain that. So the effort right now is to bring everyone to the table, to find a compromise solution that will be satisfactory to all parties involved. And we think that there are landing zones that could be reached on this particular issue.
And can you give an indication of where do you think this landing zone might be, as you are very well aware of all the different positions around the negotiating table?
I can't, unfortunately. I mean, I'm not a member. I'm not negotiating, so I can't preempt what members will say. I'm just indicating that it doesn't have to be all or nothing. Okay. That we can get to a package. You know, nobody will ever get 100% of what they want when you're in the negotiations, but they will get a satisfactory solution to the problems that we're envisaging. All those who wanted to make sure they have access to intellectual property or to technology transfer to be able to make the vaccines and other medical goods. I think we would be able to find a way, as well as then give reassurance to those who think this will lead to innovation being blocked or research not being incentivized. I really think if all parties are willing to come to the table, that we could find some landing zones.
Okay, maybe one final question on the issue of vaccine equity. As you mentioned, export restrictions. As the head of the World Trade Organization, with the Omicron variant now troubling the world, how worried are you about the impact on the global economy?
Oh, I'm quite worried. I'm really worried. I think having this Omicron variant has definitely put a damper, will put a damper on the recovery. You know, we're on our way to a fairly robust but uneven recovery. And that uneven recovery was based on two things. You know, the access to fiscal stimulus and monetary easing in the richer countries, or if you want to put it the other way, the lack of fiscal space in the poorer countries to be able to implement fiscal stimulus, and then access to vaccines. Both the IMF in their work and ourselves at the WTO in looking at trade and the factors in the recovery of trade, it found that these two issues are definitely the biggest determinants of which countries are recovering robustly and those who are not. So we have this divergent and uneven recovery because of access to vaccines. So that is why I've said that vaccine inequity is just not acceptable. We've seen this Omicron variant. And I think if we don't work really hard to solve this problem, we will continue to have these difficulties, which at the end of the day, they're going to really pose a huge downside risk to a sustainable economic recovery for the world.
Okay, so all the more need to find a solution by the deadline that you have set today, if I understand correctly. Let me address one final subject, if I may. We later tonight have an interview with Frans Timmermans, the Commission's Executive Vice President, who is in charge of the European Green Deal. You have been critical on the EU's plans for a carbon border levy. What is your message to him, to our European audience on these plans?
Well, I don't know if you characterize what I've said as being critical of the EU's plans. What I've been critical of is the fragmented approach worldwide to the issue of carbon taxes or carbon pricing. A system in which you have 68 to 69 different carbon taxing or pricing regimes is one that is very difficult for those who are trading to navigate, for businesses to navigate, for countries that are poorer to understand. So what I've been advocating is that instead of this fragmented system, we move towards a methodology that can lead us to a global carbon price. So on the one hand, you can say that, look, countries that are coming up, or even jurisdictions within countries coming up with approaches to carbon prices, kudos to them for trying to think of a way to incentivize a low carbon development pathway. But if you look at it from a global point of view, this fragmentation is somewhat problematic. That is what I'm talking about. And I think it would be easier if we worked towards a global carbon price. So, and we have to be careful that in trying to do these things, the poorer members, the developing country members at the WTO, who are quite concerned that some of these approaches to carbon pricing or taxation will end up as protectionist measures against them, or cause some kind of disincentive to their exports. We have to be sure that their views are also taken into account in any approach that we take. This is very important for trade. Otherwise, we'll have trade frictions, which will end up at the WTO. And we want to be ahead, not behind the curve, in dealing with these issues.
And so in that sense, because you know that the EU is also working with the United States on a Green Steel Alliance, which would include certain things on carbon pricing, the arrangement would be open to other countries who would like to join. Is that then maybe a better approach, or is your plea willing to have this discussion within the framework of the WTO with the entire world, or almost the entire world, present at the table?
I think it would be better to have it within the framework of the WTO. And I hasten to say that right now there's the IMF, the OECD, and ourselves are starting to cooperate to think of a methodology that could be acceptable and would take into account the issues that are put on the table. So I think that work, we should pursue it and see if it will lead us to a global approach that will be much more acceptable. Whatever is done with respect to the price, to the steel issue, green steel and so on, we would very much hope that it will be done within the context of WTO rules so that we don't have a situation in which we have, again, trade frictions. And people bringing cases to the WTO.
Okay, it sounds like a lot of work on your plate. I want to thank you again for being with us tonight, and we hope to see you soon again here in Brussels live. Thank you again, and now I give the floor back to Josh.
Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you to our number one, or number two, should I say, disruptor on the Politico 28 list for 2022. Now, let's get into the meat of it and address the leaders of our top categories for the list. We have videos prepared to go with each one, so let's get into it. First off, it's been a very big day for our number one doer.
Leading one of the EU's biggest economies comes with a lot of power baked in already. But this newly ascended European leader has some big shoes to fill. His challenge? To figure out a way to leverage the power of his office in ways his predecessor often wouldn't. Our number one doer is German Chancellor Olaf Scholz.
So the secret's out, and joining me to discuss Germany's new leader is our European politics reporter Hans von der Borchardt. He's been tracking Olaf Scholz right through the campaign. He even tracked down the guy's barber in Hamburg. So moin Hans, how are you doing this evening? So, a lot of action today. Scholz formally took office. How did it go?
Well, of course, for Scholz, it went really well. He was elected as expected with a comfortable majority of 395 votes. There was a lot of standing applause. There were floral bouquets. Then he quickly drove off to the Bellevue Palace. That's where the German president, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, then received him and officially appointed him as a chancellor. Then he went back to the Bundestag to swear the oath. And then he took over the chancellery from Angela Merkel. They did a short little press conference where they said some nice words about each other and shook hands and smiled to the camera. So it was really a beautiful display, I would say, of a peaceful, well-working transition in the democracy.
Okay, and of course he's on our list because he has much to do on his to-do list. And as Jamil told us earlier, you know, a lot of the names that we have on the list for next year are people that are really trying to address the problems that his predecessor, Chancellor Angela Merkel, didn't really deal with in her time in office. So, you know, is there any evidence so far that Chancellor Scholz will be perhaps more assertive in tackling major problems in foreign policy, but also in climate protection, for example, European affairs, than Merkel has been for the last 16 years?
Well, that's actually the really big question. How different is Scholz going to be from Merkel? Today at this press conference I just mentioned in the Chancellery, where he officially took over the baton from Merkel, he said, perhaps not so much is going to change. He was referring to the mentality, the working mentality, because Merkel is coming from Mecklenburg-Vorpommern and he grew up in Hamburg. So he was saying, well, we've got sort of the same mentality, but people are, of course, asking in terms of policy, how much is going to change. We know that Scholz has been, as a finance minister, often closely aligned to what Merkel did. But this coalition agreement, which is also the Green Party and the pro-business FDP party in it, they are pushing quite hard to bring in some change, especially on issues such as rule of law with Poland and Hungary, for example, but also relations with China. However, so the China, I should mention, they want a stronger or a tougher approach of Germany towards China. However, I should mention that at his first, or not yet as a chancellor, but one of his first press conferences, one day ahead of becoming chancellor yesterday, Scholz took a rather soft line towards China. So we need to see what's going to happen. There's a lot of expectations, but it's still up in the air whether he's actually going to introduce a major change from Merkel.
Understood. So we have a few minutes to chat this through now, Hans. I wonder, in terms of the coalition makeup, we've seen a very, very long time ago, but more than two-party coalitions in federal German politics. But this obviously is quite a novel situation now. You have Scholz leading a three-way coalition with the Greens and the Liberal FDP. Do you think this is going to be a harmonious agreement? Obviously, there were many smiles, everybody saying the right things today, but there are some pretty fundamental disagreements about policy moves here. Do you anticipate the new government is going to be one of agreement moving forward, or as we as journalists going to enjoy quite a few juicy scraps in the months and years ahead?
Oh, well, Josh, these scraps are definitely going to come. There's a lot of conflict in there. This was, by the way, yesterday also admitted by one of the state secretaries, Sven Giegold from the Greens, who's going into the newly founded Economic and Climate Ministry. He was openly on the record deploring that the FDP is in the coalition because so many things that his Green Party would have liked and loved to implement together with the SPD had to be dialed down a little bit because the FDP brought some more pro-business views in there. And we see, for example, that the FDP is also has appointed the transport minister. That is a job, of course, that is quite crucial in this green transition. So there are some questions really how, for example, how green or how easy is this green transition going to be? But also on many other questions, as I just mentioned, foreign policy, China, how happy are the Greens and the FDP going to be with Scholz' China policy? So there are many issues where we are actually going to see some friction is just unavoidable. And let's not forget, everybody's smiling now as there's a coalition agreement. They found an agreement quite quickly, which is remarkable. But we need to see, of course, how this holds up once we hit the first crisis. And if we've got any past experience from the Merkel years, is these crises, Jay, just look around every corner.
Right, and you've been reporting a little bit on Scholz's early plans. Do we know what his first foreign trips are going to be yet?
Yes, we do indeed. So on Friday, he's going to Paris to meet Emmanuel Macron. That's actually a longstanding German tradition because of this close Franco-German partnership, this alliance that a new chancellor, a new president goes to Paris or to Berlin. And so he will go there. They will speak, they'll hold a press conference. Then Scholz will right away head off to Brussels. Also, that is almost a standard program. He will meet European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and also Council President Charles Michel to basically have a first discussion on his European policy and also prepare the upcoming European Council next week. That is going to be an important one just before the French presidency kicks off in January. So there are a lot of things to talk about. The French presidency of the Council of the EU, I should say.
Yeah, and that brings me perfectly on to the next question, Hans, which is to talk about your reporting around the members of the team that Scholz has brought in to be his Europe advisor, his finance advisor, this kind of stuff. These are crucial people when it comes to determining the big topics around Scholz, the big policy questions and how to engage with Europe. Is there any evidence so far to see what kind of German government we're going to have in council sessions, how Scholz is going to engage with these big European questions of integration, of financial reform, that kind of stuff? Any reporting you can give us in the early stages now?
Of course, the choices for ministers are interesting, and we've reported quite a lot about the cabinet, Christian Lindner, and I think we can talk about him a bit more even later. But he is, of course, an interesting choice as finance minister, although not surprising. So that is going to be a more hawkish financial view. Then we got Robert Habeck as this super economic and climate minister, who will try to bring together, Germany's economic interests and the interests of the Green parties in the climate transition. Also the European Union's interest, of course, now with the Green Deal. But what's also very interesting is the aides that Scholz chose in the Chancellery. So there are two names that came out today. One of them is Jörg Kukies, who is a former Goldman Sachs banker who has been working together with Scholz in his previous function as finance minister and vice chancellor. And there he has been the architect of this coronavirus recovery fund that is now hyped quite a lot as a big achievement in European integration. So this Jörg Kukies will become a sort of super aide under Olaf Scholz now in the Chancellery. He will oversee both economic and financial policy and European integration. So that's normally two different jobs for two different persons. So quite remarkable that. And we see probably that could be a first indication that Scholz is putting there somebody who has already achieved quite a lot in terms of European integration, has also been breaking with some taboos. I mean, this recovery fund goes a bit closer and it edges a bit towards what the French or other southern countries always wanted, the so-called Eurobonds, the pooling of European debt. So this guy has made it possible, and he's now in an important position. And then there is another person, and that's Jens Plötner, and he is the foreign policy and security policy advisor. He's a top diplomat, career diplomat from the foreign ministry, has been ambassador to Sri Lanka and Tunisia. He has been serving under the former German foreign minister, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, who's now the president. He has also been a spokesperson. He has a lot of experience, and he is now in this crucial foreign policy role. So that gives us some indication where the journey goes.
Thanks. That's great context for the team around Scholz as we move forward. And I can't let you leave, Hans, without a brief question about our number 4 disruptor, and that's Christian Lindner, the new finance minister as of today. Now, a lot of people are quite worried about having a fiscal hardliner in such an important position in Berlin. Should we be worried?
Well, first of all, I would say that in many of the views that Lindner has been articulating during his election campaigns, they were actually not so different from what Olaf Scholz did as a finance minister. So yes, of course, he has been together with his aide Kukies, who just mentioned, introduced this Eurobond, the Coronavirus Recovery Fund. That's, by the way, also something that Lindner supports. But on issues such as debt rules, changing the European debt rules, Scholz has also always said, no, the current rules are good and they provide sufficient flexibility. So there it's not such a big change. What's interesting now is that the coalition agreement actually says there is, or there might be, some room to talk about a change, for example, of European debt rules. And the big question will be, of course, how Lindner is going to implement this coalition agreement, which leaves some sort of back door open to such a discussion. The other interesting question about Lindner is how is he actually going to perform in government, because he has been never been in a big leadership position, neither at the local nor state level. So that's quite something new, because finance ministers before have had some substantial government experience and governance experience before becoming finance ministers. So that's definitely a new thing about Lindner. And many people are also surprised and asking now, see, like, okay, how's this guy who definitely made his party, revived it from political near death and brought it back to government, how is he going to perform in government?
Thank you very much, Hans von der Borchardt, for that ace reporting from Berlin.
Thank you.
Now on to Paris for our number 1 dreamer, but not for who you might originally be expecting.
Clearing traffic off the streets of a major European capital was always going to be a big fight. But as she transforms her city from a smoggy metropolis into a cyclist's utopia, this local leader offers a model for the post-car future. Our number 1 dreamer is Paris Mayor Anne Hidalgo.
So, the number 1 dreamer is out, and that gives me an ace opportunity to transfer to Paris over Zoom, where we've got our politics reporter Clea Calcut. She's written a brilliant profile of Anne Hidalgo in the magazine for Politico 28 this year. That'll be available in some places in Brussels over the coming days, also with our future events. So I'd encourage you to get a copy. The article itself will be online in the coming days on our main site. Bonsoir, Clea. Why is Anne Hidalgo so high up our list this year?
Well, I think it's fair to say that she has really changed the face of Paris in the last, decade. Introduced kilometers of bicycle lanes, banned cars from big areas of the town, so the banks of the Seine, the main street in Paris. She's cleared parking spaces and put cafe terraces instead. And it's really been an uphill struggle because the French are quite conservative when it comes to Paris, the Paris heritage. And so therefore, it has not always been easy for her to bring about these changes. But urbanists say that she really brought about a tipping point in behavior. And I can see it myself around Paris, is that everybody is on their bikes, their e-scooters, their electric bikes, they're zooming down the streets. And with the emergency of tackling climate change, she's really made her mark here in Paris. And so therefore, that's why she's very high up on our idealist list.
Right, and this is a topic that we write about at Politico very often, this argument about reducing car traffic in cities, reducing pollution, making urban areas more livable. Generally, that's not just a question for Parisians, but also for people living in Berlin, where I live most of the time, in London, in Amsterdam, across Europe. And the reason that Anne Hidalgo has really made such a name for herself is this vicious fight against motorists effectively by banning cars in certain areas. So I wonder, for you as somebody that lives in Paris, Clea, well, what's it like living in Anne Hidalgo's vision of the City of Lights?
Well, I myself am a bike convert since Hidalgo introduced all these bike lanes. And so you can see that it really has an impact on people. And when I go through Paris, it's really breathtaking, the sort of scenes that you see, the banks of the Seine, the Palais Royal, the bridges, and but on the flip side is that these changes have come in at such a dramatic level on certain boulevards now. At rush hour, there's more bicycles than cars, and there's not really a bicycle culture, and so you see a lot of aggression on the street. E-scooters zooming up pavements, people complaining of chaos. And another thing that, for example, an advisor to Hidalgo told me is that she's very interested in the big ideas, but when it comes to the nitty-gritty detail, she's not that interested. And so some of her big scale projects seem a bit haphazard and a bit quick. But also you've got to take into account that people are very resistant to change ultimately. Even if we all do feel that we've got to do something about climate change, when it actually comes to our habits and facing disruption in our own lives, there's a bit of a backlash against her at the moment.
Right, and of course she's on our list, Clea, because of her work in Paris specifically, but there's a bigger dimension to this because she at some point had quite big ambitions to be president of France. That campaign has kind of fallen flat before it even got started. Why is that?
Well, yes, it really hasn't taken off. I mean, she's very low in the polls. She's at 4 or 5%, which is very low, and there's calls at the moment for her to either stand down or to do something to boost her bid. I think there's several reasons behind this. One is that she's a politician made in Paris, and so that she's always been on the defensive, defending her mandate, with an electorate that's very much left-wing, very, attuned to environmentalists. She's never been a challenger. She's always been on the left, but moving into national politics, she really is becoming a challenger because the center of gravity in France is very much to the right, very much to the far right. And if she has wanted to make an impact, she would have had to have a much more punchy, a much more risk-taking campaign. And so far, it hasn't been the case. She has not wanted to debate with the far right provocateur Eric Zemmour. Her proposals, are not really very kind of wish-washy. They don't really sort of make an impact on the news. And also there's the background of the deep division within the left. I mean, they really have not been able to rebuild themselves after their defeat in 2017 when Emmanuel Macron took the Elysee, and their score was really extremely low. They haven't managed to rebuild their troops. The ecologists, the left, the far left, are all presenting different candidates, and so therefore they're really trailing behind at the moment.
Thank you, Claire. And so final question for you before we head to our number one disruptor is, in Paris, is it all about the Olympics now? Is that the big end game? Many of the changes to urban life in Paris being pitched in the context of this great push to modernize Paris in time for the Olympics. Is that a correct understanding from here?
Yes, I mean, COVID is always the top priority. I mean, the top thing that people have on their minds. The Olympics do seem quite far away as we're entering yet another wave, but all the sights are turning towards the Olympics, and I think the Olympics will be a real test for Hidalgo in terms of her commitment to fighting climate change, to sustainable living, because necessarily the Olympic Games can be quite carbon consuming. It's difficult to build things on sustainably and also in a short span of time. And a lot of people, especially on the left, environmental movement, say, Olympic Games is not where a sort of green left-wing mayor should be aiming for. And she justifies it by saying that Paris, after the attack, the terrorist attacks that it's been through, really needs something, something positive, something to bring it together, of a spirit of, competition and goodwill. And so that's her justification for bringing the Olympics. But yeah, I mean, there's even recently, there's been questions as to whether Paris will be ready and have all the facilities in place to welcome the Olympic Games.
Great. Thank you very much, Claire, for your time tonight. And just to remind you, her story is in the magazine, Politico 28. Her profile of Anne Hidalgo will also be on the main side of Politico in the coming days. So keep your eyes out for that. Now for our number one disruptor. That's the person set to transform things a little bit next year in their very own way in their chosen field. Let's run the video.
He's returned home for one more fight. And this time, it's personal. A former prime minister and ex-top European official, this opposition leader has returned to the coalface of domestic politics for a shot at his old job. His goal is to pull his country back into the heart of European affairs. Our number one disruptor is Poland's Donald Tusk.
Okay. So all three of those names are out. Let's quickly now go to Warsaw, and our correspondent who often writes about Polish politics, Zosia Vanat. Dobry wieczór, Zosia. How are you?
Dobry wieczór, Josh. How are you?
Yeah, I'm not bad, thanks. A little bit hungry, but otherwise well. What chance does Tusk have of capturing power in Poland in the election in 2023 or the coming year, if it happens earlier?
Oh, that's a very good question, Josh. I think Donald Tusk himself would like to know the answer to that. So, if we look at the polls right now, you would see that Tusk's party, the Civic Platform, it is scoring at around 25% of support, while the ruling Law and Justice Party, which Tusk would like to beat, is getting around 37% of support. So this gap is quite big right now. And if the election was tomorrow, it's quite unlikely that Tusk would actually win it. So the big question right now is whether he and the Civic Platform, if they are going to manage to unite the other opposition parties around them, around Tusk as a leader and around the Civic Platform as the biggest opposition party. And Tusk seems to believe that this is the way forward. He says that this is a patriotic duty of all those smaller opposition parties to join him and to beat the Law and Justice piece together. But the leaders of those smaller opposition parties, they don't seem to be that convinced that Tusk is the man who would lead them to the victory in any upcoming election.
And what kind of impact has he made since returning to Warsaw? Is he often on talk shows? Is he a very public figure in Polish political life?
Yes, you could see him much more often in TV interviews. He also takes part in all those protests and demonstrations that have been going on in Warsaw against different policies of the Law and Justice Party. Many say that Tusk has re-energized the civic platform, the party, that he injected a new hope into this party, that it is actually able to win an election again. And you could see that in the polls. You could see that voters actually are feeling it, because when he announced his big comeback earlier this year, there was a spike in the polls for the Civic Platform Party. But at the same time, there are other people who say that Tusk's legacy is actually a burden for the civic platform. So Tusk served as the Polish prime minister for 7 years. And during this time, he left many people dissatisfied, disillusioned, feeling left behind with some of the policies he proposed or didn't propose. And people still remember that. And if you look at some of the rankings, which are published even today, right now, you could see that Tusk is still one of the least trustworthy politicians in the country.
Interesting. And so I wonder, he's obviously, a very final question for you, he's obviously a very known figure here in Brussels, but does his experience, does his time here in Brussels count for him or against him in Poland?
And again, the answer to this question here is twofold. So on the one hand, obviously his experience as the president of the European Council has made him, like one of the most international politicians in Poland. And he met all those world leaders. He shook all these hands. He understands the international diplomacy. He understands the challenges, the global challenges ahead of Poland, ahead of the EU. But at the same time, there are people who say that he actually ran away, that he escaped to Brussels when his party needed him the most. And because he left the party, it was one of the reasons why the party didn't win the election in 2015. So again, it doesn't really make him the most trustworthy as a leader.
Thank you, Zosha, for your time tonight. Do widzenia.
Do widzenia. Thank you.
Okay, so now the big three names are out. We'll come back later for our overall number one in the Politico 28 list. Now it's time for our headline interview. My playbook author and colleague Susanna Lynch is now in conversation with the European Commission's Executive Vice President for Climate Action, and I think the biggest Bruce Springsteen fan in the whole of Brussels, if not Belgium entirely. Susanna, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I did not know that. I'm sure a lot of people on this tuning into this did not know that either. But Commissioner, we're not here to discuss your musical talents and tastes. It's for your role in the climate change agenda here. Yes. So you're the Executive Vice President, but you're also best known as the figurehead, if you like, the Commissioner in charge of the EU's Green Deal. And congratulations for your recognition on this list, this ranking. And I mean, just to kind of start off, I think it is fair to say that the EU is, a leader when it comes to climate change generally. I myself spent the last few years in America, and coming back to Brussels, I was struck by the fact that the environmental agenda, the climate change agenda, is so much more central both to everyday people, everyday life, and also policy. Yes. But there are also a lot of challenges in implementing that agenda. We're just after finishing COP I know you're meeting the US climate envoy, John Kerry, tomorrow, who's in town here. So maybe just let's focus on the fallout from COP and how that went. I mean, what are your feeling on that? For example, the EU was criticised in some quarters for not doing more to bring other countries along. I mean, is there more you can do, the European Commission, in that regard?
Well, I think we were essential in bringing all the countries together. I think we did play that role in Glasgow. I think certainly at the last hour, when all of a sudden the Chinese and the Indians had extra demands on the final text, we were able to keep things together and we were able to find a compromise. And I think the EU played that role. And I was able to play that role because the member states allowed me to play that role. All the ministers who were there were very supportive. The European Parliament was extremely supportive. So we had a real Team Europe feeling there, and that helped us. And our credibility was based on the fact that we're the only ones who actually have a full-fledged plan to get to climate neutrality in 2050 and to reduce our emissions with at least 55% by 2030.
And what about, for example, there's been agreements with South Africa. I mean, is there any more concrete plans to do this with other countries, India?
Well, other countries are very interested in that model, and we need to make a success of that model in South Africa. And then I'm sure countries like Indonesia and indeed India will be interested to follow similar models. For those countries, decarbonising, getting out of coal is extremely complicated. But they're committing to that, which is quite audacious. And they deserve our support in that trajectory. And South Africa has the extra challenge of an energy sector in difficulty. And I think it's in all our interest to help South Africa solve those problems and actually engage in a trajectory towards climate neutrality as well.
And also, if you think more domestically within Europe, I mean, this ambition, this Fit for 55 package is happening at a time of rising costs for consumers, of rising inflation, of rising energy prices, which is becoming a huge political issue across Europe. You have a long political experience yourself in government as well as here in Brussels, and that is obviously a difficult issue for ministers around the table. Are you worried now that the momentum, that you can harness this momentum, given a lot of misgivings around Europe about the extra cost involved in this plan?
Well, you know, even in this pandemic, if you ask Europeans what is the one subject that keeps you awake, or what do you worry about most, their answer will be climate change. So we do have that going for us, that our citizens understand that this is something we need to deal with. But at the same time, it's not just the climate crisis we're facing, it's not just the threat of ecocide. We're in the middle of the most profound economic revolution, industrial revolution, since the first industrial revolution. So this is an age of disruption, of profound revolutionary change. And that's going to create a lot of unrest in our population worldwide. And the art of politics will be, how do we organize ourselves in such a way that our citizens have the feeling and have the understanding that will guide them through this age of transformation. But it's going to be an age of transformation whether we act or not. The only question is, are we going to organize this transformation to the benefit of the whole of society, yes or no?
I mean, the Commission has talked about the idea of a social fund to kind of compensate, if you like, the poorer. Is this just going to be more kind of EU money just given to countries, throwing money at the problem? Or any more detail on that?
Well, the thing is, what we're proposing there's two sectors where we're not really doing well. Transport, emissions are going up. And in buildings and housing, the reduction of energy consumption is only half of where we actually need to be. So we need to do more there. And we thought, we've looked at all different models, all things you could do, and we thought a dedicated emissions trading system would be best suited for this, because you put the onus on the providers of the energy in those sectors. And of course, people will say immediately, yes, but they will, put that into their pricing, and then eventually the citizens will pay. Well, they will have to pay for their emissions. That money will go, like with the other ETS system, partly into a fund, a climate social fund. That will be to the tune of about 70 billion euros. And member states are then put in a position to spend that, for instance, to compensate citizens for higher energy prices. You could give them grants. You could give them, like in Denmark, they give people checks so that they can renovate their homes. You can also invest in low emission or zero emission vehicles. You can do all sorts of things to compensate our citizens for higher prices or for the changes they need to go into. And I believe that's a better system than just imposing tax or imposing regulation.
But there is a political reality that there is not much appetite to extend ETS to building and transport.
Well, you'd be surprised to see, initially, quite a number of member states were rather reluctant. And then they also understand they've committed to the reduction of 55% by 2030 and to climate neutrality by 2050. In law, it's a legal obligation. And my answer to them is always very simple. If you have a better method of getting us there, please tell us. And we're open for that. But step by step, I think more and more member states come to the conclusion that this might be the optimal system as compared to different solutions.
But is it not the responsibility of the Commission to come up with an alternative if you're running into a bit of a brick wall with this issue about extending the ETS? Or are you confident you will have enough back?
I think we can make it. I also believe it's our responsibility to come up with a comprehensive plan to get us to minus 55 and to zero. And that's what we've done. And it's comprehensive, it's holistic. So if you want to remove one of the elements, then the one who removes the element has a responsibility to come with an alternative. That's not our responsibility. We've proposed a comprehensive plan.
On another, just a couple of more specific issues. One thing that we're going to be hearing a lot about in the next few weeks is the European taxonomy.
Yes.
And we've seen drafts where there's proposal to include nuclear and gas. I mean, is this not a sellout by the European Union if they're going to include those forms of energy in this?
Well, there's green and there's not green. What is green we've already put into our first delegated act on taxonomy, that's clear. But there are two energy sources that are necessary in this transition. Nuclear, because some of our member states will make that choice to go for nuclear energy. Not all, some really reject it, others it's a sovereign choice of member states whether they want nuclear or not. Nuclear has a huge advantage of being zero emissions, but it's not sustainable, it's not green. And then there's natural gas, which obviously is a fossil fuel, but is absolutely necessary in the transition away from coal to sustainable energy. So we have to account for the fact that these two energy sources play a crucial role in our energy transition. Now, how that lands into the taxonomy is something we're still discussing internally, and we want to take a decision before the end of the year. But taxonomy, I mean, do we understand what taxonomy is? Taxonomy is just a tool for investors to know what is green and what is not.
So do you expect that both will be there, the nuclear and the gas?
Well, I think we need to find a way of recognizing that these two energy sources play a role in the energy transition. That does not make them green, but it does acknowledge the fact that nuclear being zero emissions is very important to reduce emissions, and that natural gas will be very important in transiting away from coal into renewable energy.
So you do expect a proposal by the end of the year?
Yes, I do.
Yeah,
yes.
Okay. One other issue on these, because I want to just broaden it out a little bit more as well, but the other proposal that's been kind of interesting, controversial, has been the carbon border adjustment tax. Yes. This idea of applying a charge, if you like, on incoming products, depending how much carbon they generate or produce. And there's been some resistance to this. We just heard, actually, just before he came on, the WTO director in her interview saying about I just took some notes here, is opposed to the idea of a fragmented approach to carbon pricing and would prefer to be working towards a global carbon price. And the need to have it within the framework of the WTO. The US in particular has been open about their opposition to this. Are you going to be discussing this tomorrow?
Well, again, the US started with opposition to it, and then the US came to the understanding, well, if we want to decarbonize our economy, we have to put a price on carbon. If we put a price on carbon, our industry might leave the US or might be in a competitive disadvantage to others who don't put a price on carbon. So we need to correct that. That's what we're doing. So if those economies who know that they need to decarbonize. They know that they have to put a price on carbon. That's the only way to decarbonize. You can do it in different ways. We're doing it using the market. You can also use regulation or taxation to do that. But in the end, you will have to see whether putting the price on carbon is done in a comparative way. If other major trading partners do comparable things, pricing carbon in a comparable way, then obviously we will not need to apply CBAM in our commercial relations with them. But if others don't do that, we need to protect ourselves against the risk of carbon leakage.
So is it fair to say then that the EU might not have to put CBAM on if another country, i.e. the US, has its own alternative proposal?
Well, the whole idea of CBAM is to prevent carbon leakage. Carbon leakage is your industry leaving to go and produce elsewhere where the norms are lower, or another producer from elsewhere producing against lower norms coming into your market with lower prices. That's what you need to protect against. And CBAM is a way of doing that. And this will be necessary in any economy that puts a price on carbon, because as long as the whole world... But I mean, it would be wonderful if the whole world would put a price on carbon. We're a long way from that situation.
So would you be open, would the EU be open to some kind of exemption for a certain trading partner?
I think we need to, I mean, it would be easier if everyone would just join a form of emissions trading system. Then it would be really comparable. We have to be realistic. There's not that much appetite at the federal level in the US to have an emissions trading system, but they will find other ways of putting a price on carbon. Regulation or taxation. Then we have to make sure we can compare it. Does it have the same effect on their industry as our ETS has on our industry? If that's comparable, there is no risk of carbon leakage between us. So there would be no need of having a CBAM between us.
Yeah, so they would be open to that kind of, in that situation, exemption. And then one of the other points, I mean, getting back to what we spoke to at the beginning about the implications of the entire climate change, the economic implications of this. I mean, the WTO's point earlier about carbon pricing, about, or the carbon border tax, will poor countries be damaged by that kind of model? How responsible is the EU being in that sense?
Well, first of all, we need to make sure investments into poorer countries are increased, private investment, but also public money. So we need to put more money on the table for adaptation in developing countries. We need to look at the issue of loss and damage, which are two issues that will come back for the next COP in Egypt. And we need to prepare for that. We need to prepare for that well, and that will be one of the subjects I want to discuss with John Kerry tomorrow. And we need to look for ways to avoid that the way you apply your rules to developing countries stifles their development. On the one hand, we don't want that. But at the other hand, we don't want our industry to go and produce in a dirty way in those countries either. Okay. So that's where you have to strike a balance.
Okay, just moving out a little bit away from the climate agenda. You're obviously a senior figure in the European Commission. And actually this does link into the climate. I mean, are you worried about some of the broader challenges for the Commission at the moment? There seems to be just ongoing tensions between the East and West within the European Union, even on the issue of climate. I mean, Poland, for example, has been very strong on climate change issue, very resistant to some of the things the European Commission is proposing. Are you worried about rule of law and those kind of issues in Eastern countries like Poland and Hungary?
Well, there are so many issues that could keep me awake at night if I choose to be worried all the time. But I have to say, take Poland as an example. Yes, of course, they have a huge challenge because they're still so coal dependent. I think 70% of their energy resourcing still comes from coal. But their own industry understands that there's no future in coal. So the answer to that is, how are you going to make it possible for Poland to swiftly exit out of coal and use new opportunities, industrial opportunities in coal mining regions? And there, the Just Transition Fund and all the money that's going in the direction of Poland for their economic development could be put to good use. And I believe that it would be self-defeating for Poland to oppose the Green Deal, because they're one of the best beneficiaries of the Green Deal, and they have huge potential. If you look at the attitude of the Polish population, there's very few countries where so many people buy solar panels as in Poland. They're now the biggest exporter of electric buses in Europe. So they are embracing these new economic opportunities. And Poland is a country really used to economic change, used to transformation. So those countries like Poland could really use this opportunity in a way that's very profitable for them.
But how would other member states feel about, giving more money? So, is it, say, if we're talking about the social fund,
yeah.
A country like Poland with its huge dependency on coal and a really big populous country, you're talking lots and lots of money, again, channeled through Poland, and yet they are not adhering to basic standards, as the Commission sees, of rule of law.
Well, that's why we demand that they adhere to basic standards of the rule of law. Because, I've seen the transformation of Poland since the late 1980s when I was a diplomat. And this has been one of the biggest success stories in economic and societal transformation that Europe has ever seen, Central Europe at large. And so much money was invested coming from other European countries in those countries, but not out of charity. It was solidarity based on well-informed self-interest, because these are the new markets. There are huge opportunities for Western European countries in Central and Eastern Europe. It's brought so much geopolitical stability to the wider Europe that it was an investment that has paid off tremendously well. And I think we tend to sometimes forget this. Of course, we have political tensions now with the Polish government, with the Hungarian government, and of course there are tremendously complicated issues we need to look into. And sometimes we just have to say to here and not one step further, to make them understand that the EU cannot function if we don't respect the rule of law.
And would that apply to like social fund for climate change as well, that there would be conditions there?
Well, at this stage, we're still discussing the plans related to the Recovery and Resilience Plan. And also there, because we combine the investment with also demands of reform, and one of the demands that's always been clear for Poland is respect for the rule of law.
And I mean, just to nearly coming to an end now, but I mean, again, abroad, I mean, you mentioned your earlier career as a diplomat,
yes.
and you'd experience in Russia, you're a fluent Russian speaker, and worked there. And you refer there to that kind of broader picture of Europe and the changes that have happened with the encompassing of the East in the last few decades. I mean, what do you feel when you hear discussions about building a wall on the eastern border? I mean, how did that make you feel? Do you feel disappointed that's come to this, or do you see, do you understand the call for this from Poland and other countries, the 12 countries, in fact, who've asked for this?
Well, I believe we are faced with fundamental challenges to our way of life, to the way we are organized politically and societally, and that has nothing to do with refugees. It has everything to do with a world that is changing profoundly. Compare it to the first industrial revolution. That's the only real comparison you can make. And of course, history never repeats itself, but it rhymes, as Mark Twain once wrote. And here we have to understand that this leads to a lot of insecurity in so many people. And I don't want to sound like Yoda, but I'll quote Yoda. You know, insecurity leads to fear, and fear leads to anger, and anger leads you to hate, and hate leads you to the dark side. And that's the dark side is out there. And we have our main task as politicians in the Western world today is to prevent the Western world from sliding into the dark side. And that's a real threat. And I hope people will understand how close we can get to the dark side if we don't mobilize people of goodwill.
And within Europe, you're talking...
Within Europe, within the Western world at large, I would say.
There's a Summit for Democracy tomorrow. Ursula von der Leyen will be speaking, and yet we've got one country in the European Union who hasn't even made the cut for that. So,
indeed.
You know, how has the European Union, as the European Commission, been too soft in not taking a harder line on some of these countries and their commitment to rule of law?
Well, during the years I had responsibility for this issue, I think we were very tough with them. But then, you know, we got full backing from the European Parliament, and then it went to the Council, and then it sort of petered out in the Council. I think the onus here is really on the Member States and the Council, not on the European Parliament and not on the European Commission.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that. Great conversation, and thank you for joining us here live. It's nice to be doing this in person, considering the context at the moment. We're just across from the Berlaymont here in the Schumann Quarter. So thank you very much, Frans.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. Thank you very much, Mr. Timmermans, for what was, I thought, a very interesting, brilliant interview. So now we can move on to unveiling our #1 overall most powerful person in Europe for next year. Did you guess yet? Let's play the video.
He's been credited with saving the euro. Now, can he save his own country? A longtime technocrat might not be the type of person you'd pick to transform one of the EU's underperforming economies. Still, that's exactly what one ex-central banker has the chance to do next year, while filling some of the power vacuum created by the departure of German Chancellor Angela Merkel. But if he wants to make an impact, he better get a move on. His country's leaders usually don't last very long. Our pick for this year's most powerful person in Europe is Italian Prime Minister Mario Draghi.
Great. So we've unveiled all of our names now. So if you go to politico.eu, you'll be able to read more about Mario Draghi, more about Frans Timmermans, more about the other people on the Politico 28 list this year. But of course, being our overall #1 means we should delve a little bit deeper into why we've put Mario Draghi on the list, what opportunity he has to influence European politics next year. And to do that, I'm joined by my brilliant senior EU politics reporter, Jacopo Barragazzi. Ciao, Jacopo.
Ciao, how are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks. You?
Yeah.
Yeah? Super. So, we have a great magazine out that you're going to be able to find around Brussels in the coming days, and that has an article by you about Mario Draghi's kind of techno-populist, and you talk about Italy as being a traditional laboratory for big political movements, something that dates back almost 100 years. Can you just talk a little bit about your theory there and how Mario Draghi fits into that?
Simply, Italy has been a political lab for a very long time. One of the examples, of course, it's a negative example, is with fascism. You know, when you watch a Charlie Chaplin movie, The Great Dictator, you see the character plays Hitler going to visit Mussolini because Mussolini is the one from whom Hitler is actually learning and copying. Then Berlusconi, there was a book 20 years ago in France by Pierre Mousseau. The book was entitled Sarko-Berlusconism, which was explaining how much Berlusconi, with this mixture between modern marketing technique and old conservative values, was becoming something that on the right they were copying. I mean, also Trump somehow had some features, some characters that were in Italy, in the Italian lab, were actually embodied by Berlusconi some time before, and this applies to many other things. I mean. Just take the media. Italy has started the last century with Mussolini, who was a journalist turned dictator, the only journalist turned dictator, and then ends the century with a tycoon turned prime minister, Berlusconi.
Yeah.
So it's a continuous kind of lab.
There's a weird symmetry there.
Yes, exactly. And so here I refer just to the last experiment, which is to have a government that keeps together these two sides. So on the one hand, the technocrats, and on the other hand, the populists. And which, you know, for the last 20, 30 years, these two categories have been coming more and more at the center of the political arena because of many reasons, because of the fact that left and right were changing, because of the collapse of the Soviet Union, because of the idea that there is no alternative, you know, the famous so all these kind of things. And we had the populists and the technocrats as the two major categories, among the two major categories of European politics in the last 20 years. And they refer to a book that came out a few months ago by Oxford University Press, very interesting because it explains one theory behind it. That they seem different, very different, populists and technocrats.
Yeah.
But this book argues that
you
no.
would say they're the opposite almost.
The opposite, the opposite. But this book argues that no, they have much in common. And one of the things that they have in common is that both of them pretend to represent the entirety, the whole electoral body. And both of them don't work just for a part, the name parties, because political parties, because they represent a part. Yeah. Both the technocrats and the populists want to represent the whole electoral body. And I quote another good political scientist that says that another thing they have in common is that it's difficult to disagree with the populists, because the populists tell you that if you disagree with them, you are against the people. Mm-hmm. If you disagree with the technocrats, they tell you that basically you're not smart enough to understand.
And you have that in the story.
Yes.
It's a very, very nice line. Just on Draghi personally and specifically, now he's been in office for about 10 months now, right?
February, yeah.
Yeah. So his popularity is still quite high, and that's quite unusual. I mean, Italian prime ministers, as we've spoken about many times, they don't tend to stick around too long. So why is Mario Draghi so popular right now?
Many reasons. I mean, Mario Draghi has a strong reputation internationally, but at the same time he arrived with a big check because of all the money coming from the recovery fund that he had to put on the table the reforms for this money, and at the same time he worked pretty well on vaccinations, actually very well, and all the strategy worked. Now, if you are an Italian, you see figures of economic growth in Italy of something like 6%.
Yeah.
If you are a German that you are 20 years old, you are just one chancellor, Angela Merkel. If you are an Italian, you have several prime ministers, but one thing in common, basically no economic growth. Now, all of a sudden, I know that it is part because everybody knows it is part because of what happened with COVID and the economy is bouncing back. But I mean, all these kind of things are contributing to the atmosphere that Draghi is actually saving the country.
And what's the update right now? Because there's a lot of talk in Rome, of course, that maybe he's going to move to be the president at some point. Maybe he'll stick around for the whole of next year. What do you think is the most likely scenario for Mario Draghi next year in politics?
That's very difficult to guess. What we can say is that some things have changed, and the populists in the coalition are going badly, both the Five Stars and the League. Mm-hmm. So in the alliance between the two, the side that seems losing ground is the populist side. So then the other thing is that it gets increasingly, I mean, it's my opinion, but I start to believe that the fact that Italy could go to elections next year starts to be increasingly possible. Yeah. And because of the fact that the Democratic Party is now going well in the elections, so there are two parties at least that have an interest to go to elections. The other one is the far right. But
of course, we should say Mario Draghi is not a member of any party, right?
He's not a member of any party. He's not a member of any party. But part of the elections next year that are key to understand the future of many things. One is the Turkish election, the other one is the Hungarian election, no doubt. But one of them will also be the presidential elections in February in Italy, to understand whether Draghi will become a president of the Republic or not, because many things on how to sort out the problem of this country that is too big to fall in terms of its debt, in terms of the Eurozone. And it has to be, and there's now this huge opportunity to a kind of Marshall Plan to actually change course and become and have the better economic growth and finally sort out, not to slide into that kind of dark side that Timmermans was talking to.
That was very evocative. That had me a little bit afraid when he was
me too.
About Star Wars. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
So, look, moving to the EU level, obviously, as we just said, Draghi doesn't have a political family, yet he does obviously get an immediate amount of gravitas in that council room because of what he's done previously, the jobs he's had, the kind of guy he is. He's very well respected. Can he replace Angela Merkel to some extent in that room at the next council meetings? Can he be the, if you like, the center of gravity politically that people defer to?
I just don't think so because of many reasons. One is exactly because of what you just mentioned, that he doesn't have a political party. And for observers of the European Council, it's clear that what happens before the European Council, when the parties meet, the socialists, the EPP, so the centre-right party, the leaders of these groups or the liberals meet before the European Council. Mario Draghi, as the previous Italian Prime Minister Conte, they arrived very late, at the last minute at the European Council, because they don't take part into the meetings of the big parties that happen before the start of the Council. So from this point of view, they are political orphans, and this plays a role. Secondly, anyway, if Draghi gets elected President of the Republic from February, March on, he's not going to be part of the European Council anymore. But even if it sticks around and it lasts for another year, there is the fact that, again, stability plays a huge role in being the key leader of the European Council. And Italy doesn't provide enough stability for that kind of figure.
I just want a final question for you, Jacopo. Pose a final question for you until we let everybody go and get their dinner, including us tonight. We've talked a lot about the recovery fund, and that is a lot of money. That's the kind of economy-defining cash that can really change things if it's spent well. And it's not just about how the allocation is spent in Italy, but also proving that it can be done effectively, so the rest of Europe, especially fiscal hardliners, don't kick off and come out with the usual cliched statements on national TV programs that some have been prone to do over the years about the Southern Europeans. How much time does he need to make his reforms work, and do you think he will get that time?
For reforms to work, it takes years, and then we go back to the problem of stability. It's not Italy hasn't done reforms in the last 20 years. They've done many reforms, but this continuous change of governments make the implementation of reforms very difficult. That's one of the reasons why having Draghi at Il Quirinale as President of the Republic will be a kind of guarantee that actually these reforms will be implemented, because again they take years. Let me conclude with one point. I was with an Italian official a few days ago who was joking that probably Draghi would have asked for less money, just because of the fact that now the difficult part is to spend that money and to spend it well.
Great. That's a perfect point to end on, I guess. And there's, as I said at the beginning, there's far more to read on politico.eu, both from Jacopo and on our list in general about all the people on the list, most of all about Mario Draghi, of course, because he's our overall number one. Thank you, Jacopo. Have a great evening. Thanks for coming, keeping me company here. Thank you also for watching online. Thanks to our sponsor Diageo for making the event possible. Of course, as I've just said, you can check out all of our coverage online. You can also find out all of our events. Next year, we'll have a dinner in March, hopefully on the Politico 28, so watch out for that. We've also got a series of regular policy events, as you full well know. I asked you at the beginning to help us help Christine Lagarde and the European Central Bank decide who should be on euro banknotes moving forward. A few of you have answered. Angela Merkel is centre, as is Mario Draghi, actually, who got a few votes as well. So that would be quite a nice departure gift to have her face on the front of a €100 note, €5 note, €50 note, whatever it is. And yes, thank you for whoever put the Eurovision Song Contest on there. That's very brave indeed. So, everybody, thank you for tuning in. Have a great night, and hopefully see you in the new year.